Understanding the current situation in Hong Kong goes beyond just the recent factors that have led to mass protests. It requires recognition of the historical context that has made the area ripe for civil unrest. British colonization of the area began with the accumulation of land in the First and Second Opium Wars in the 19th century, and the area that we now know today as Hong Kong was made official with a lease of the new territories to Britain in a 99-year lease. This British use of Hong Kong as a trade port would come to an end in 1997, when the area was transferred back to China, marking the beginning of the complex one country, two systems era. Carroll also stresses the vital fact that the Basic Law was a piece of legislation with inherent tensions from its creation. The Basic Law commits to a high level of autonomy for Hong Kong and guaranteed the PRC would not change Hong Kong's judicial systems. However, it reserves the right to amend any Hong Kong law to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress if they feel it violates Hong Kong's new Basic Law, which may be seen as a contradiction. Protests after the PRC government swelled in 2003 and 2014 were subsequently silenced. As journalists Chung and Hughes outline, most of the post-1997 protest has been a retaliation to the growing PRC imposition over Hong Kong. Hong Kong's leader is elected by a 1,200-member election committee composed of mainly pro-Beijing representatives, elected by only 6% of the eligible voters, leading to a mere 23% of Hong Kong citizens approving of central government policy in 2009. PRC control of the region, beginning in 1997, marked the beginning of an identity problem for citizens of Hong Kong that would be a festering catalyst for civil unrest. This disconnect between Hong Kong citizens and their PRC-led government is tangible. 2019 University of Hong Kong survey results show that Hong Kong citizens who don't feel proud about being Chinese has jumped to 71% of the population, the highest number since the 1997 handover. Furthermore, the survey shows that Hong Kong's younger citizens are less likely to be proud of their Chinese citizenry.
A lot of problems, like economic problems, I just mentioned, social problems, also brought by the Chinese coming into Hong Kong.
Signaling a disconnect between the population of Hong Kong and the PRC government that only looks like it'll grow with each coming generation. On February of 2019, Hong Kong Security Bureau proposed amendments to their current extradition laws. These amendments would expand on their current extradition laws and would include the addition of mainland China to their list of countries they could extradite to. Despite being only a non-binding recommendation, on March 31st, more than 1,000 people took to the streets of Hong Kong to protest these amendments. Despite this, on April 3rd, the Hong Kong government officially introduced the proposed amendments to the current extradition laws, which would allow for criminal suspects to be sent to countries such as mainland China to face trial. Following this, on April 28th, tens of thousands marched on the Legislative Council, Hong Kong's governing body, and demanded that they take action against the bill. This show of strength by the protesters encouraged opponents of the bill in the legislature to speak out, leading to physical fights breaking out between pro-Beijing and anti-Beijing legislators on May 11th. This marked a subtle change in the protests, as it was in fact the first use of violence displayed relating to the extradition bill. On June 6th, a small protest occurred in which several hundred lawyers silently marched against the bill, a practically pocket-sized precursor to the subsequent protest on June 9th, 2019, when more than 500,000 people marched on the streets of Hong Kong. Many of them cited the undermining of the policy of one country, two systems in dealing with the territory as the reason for protesting the bill. This was because it was seen as abandoning many Hong Kong citizens who would be accused by the mainland of ambiguously defining crimes, who would then succumb to the will of the much murkier mainland legal system, eroding one of their already precarious liberties. On June 12th, protesters physically prevented lawmakers from entering the Legislative Council and debating the extradition bill by taking over the surrounding streets. After rocks and metal barricades were thrown at police, officers used tear gas to dispel the crowds and allow debate to continue. This marked the first time that tear gas was used during the extradition bill protests and heralded a major change in the protests as all parties began to place more tactics on the table. On July 1st, an annual day of pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong was a significant turn in the ongoing protests, as protesters smashed into the Legislative Council after hours and defaced the interior, prompting its closure for several months. For a time, the situation continued to escalate as more reports on violence came out of the streets. Eventually, it seemed another key turning point was on the horizon, as on August 17th, military drills were held in nearby Shenyang by the People's Armed Police. The PAP are primarily used in controlling protests and riots, causing speculation that they might intervene if the protests continued to escalate. On August 25th, a water cannon was used by Hong Kong police in an attempt to not only dispel protesters, but also track them. Pepper spray was added to the water shot by the police and dye as well, so that protesters' clothes would be marked and participants of the protest could be later identified and arrested. However, this level of aggression by police forces only encouraged the protesters to redouble their efforts, and on September 4th, after 5 months of protests and no end in sight, Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam announced that the government will formally withdraw the extradition bill. After authorities withdrew the bill that ignited historic unrest, it has since morphed into a crusade for democratic change. This posed a serious challenge for China, who painted them as threats to national security, but by then, protesters vowed to not yield until their demands were met. This amplified regular demonstrations and has coiled into a pro-democracy movement. The protests increasingly turned violent as police clashed onto the streets, deploying petrol bombs and tear gas grenades without warrant. The protesters called for Carrie Lam to resign and for a proposal for an independent inquiry over police brutality emerged as social unrest worsened. What began as a resistance to an ill-conceived law only escalated into a violent outcry for change. The oppression cued the Beijing government to justify unwarranted arrests and police brutality, and with tensions building, Hong Kong's police heavy-handed crowd control response made its global debut with live uncut scenes, capturing the conjugation of violence and tyranny against protesters. Though the bill was touted as a fix to a legal loophole, it quickly triggered discontent over an unfair justice system that gave rise to an unparalleled coalition that included people across different social classes, professions, and generations. They grew enraged at the sight of Beijing encroaching on their rights, even while China denied these claims and accused foreign countries of fomenting trouble. Those involved in these activities were supposedly charged for colluding with foreign forces and other new crimes, with officials justifying it based on endangering national security. But, with the government tightening controls over education, journalists, and social media, there are now a slew of concerns over its implications on freedom. Hong Kongers believe that the withdrawal of the bill was not enough because by then, protesters had already increased their bargaining price as the movement revealed the deep-seated corruption of the Hong Kong government. It reflected the anger and discontent from the people willing to fight for freedom and democracy. The withdrawal was not considered a victory and was viewed as a way to ease tensions before China's National Day on October 1st. It wasn't until then where the city descended into violence as police opened fire as demonstrators ignited violent attacks against law enforcement. Today, there is no telling whether the withdrawal of the extradition bill is legitimate without any accountability for Hong Kong's police force. China has continued to seek integration of Hong Kong into its own political system, while bashing the demands of the pro-democracy movement using force and oppressive laws. COVID-19 was used as an additional mechanism to stop protests, as COVID protocols made mass gatherings illegal, as seen in most other countries. As of 2020, China has passed a major security law which breaches the One Country, Two Systems agreement, allowing China greater control over Hong Kong's political system. Importantly, these new security laws make it much more difficult for the citizens of Hong Kong to protest because, under the provisions of these new laws, protesters are likely to be charged with treasonous crimes and thus face tougher punishment for participating in pro-democracy protests, a cost that is not worth it for a citizen who doesn't want their kid to lose their parents. However, pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong points out that the majority of Hong Kongers have nothing to lose and everything to gain from this movement, as those same parents don't want their kids to grow up under a government that has stripped away essential rights. This puts Hong Kongers in a catch-22. Each path forward will come with tremendous costs. It used to seem like there was a light at the end of the tunnel, a light of power being restored to the people. However, as Slavoj Žižek says, that light was just another train, a train consisting of harsher laws, citizen casualties, and scared, depowered citizens.